Christopher Columbus. To many, he is still the man who discovered America. Yet there have been others before him, and he knew it. There were tales and even maps pointing the way. But who were the bold men who had preceded Columbus? Best known among them, the Viking Leif Erickson, 500 years before Columbus. A Welsh prince named Madoc, supposed to have built fortified castles along the Ohio River 300 years before Columbus. Or King Abu Bakr from West African Mali, who is said to have used his immeasurable riches to finance a gigantic fleet 200 years before Columbus. Seville, at the time of the Semana Santa. Even in the days of Columbus, the Holy Week was the biggest religious feast in all of Andalusia. The widely travelled seafarer and outstanding navigator is preparing for an extraordinary voyage that will bring him everlasting fame. In the Cathedral of Seville, they've erected a grandiose monument to honour the man who, in 1492, allegedly discovered a new continent for the Spanish crown. Columbus opened the gate of fabulous riches and to an overseas empire for Spain. To this day, his name is synonymous with the discovery of America. But was his achievement really unique? There's another tomb in the cathedral, that of his son, Hernando Colon. He inherited the personal papers of his father and spent his life collecting information about the famous discoverer. Today his library is kept in the Institución Colombina.
You might well call it the most important library of the Renaissance worldwide, because Hernando Colon strove to bring together everything about his father and all the knowledge of his time.
Columbus meticulously recorded geographical data of contemporary discoveries, as well as ancient sources. When he set out on his famous voyage, he had already travelled most of the known world. As early as 1477, one of his forays even took him as far north as the mythical island of Thule. Modern historians believe that he must have reached Iceland, the land of the sagas, with tales of its most famous inhabitant, Leif Erickson. His nickname was the Fortunate. He was born into a family of daring explorers. Leif's grandfather had emigrated from Norway to Iceland. His father, the legendary Eric the Red, had navigated the icy waters off Greenland and became the first settler on its eastern shores. Iceland. This is where Leif grew up, at Erickson, the farm of Eric the Red. When Leif was 12 years old, father was banned from Iceland for 3 years for manslaughter. Eric wasn't called the Red simply because of his fiery red hair. Archaeologist Natasha Miller is an expert on the history of the Norsemen. To her, this is familiar ground, the site where Leif and Eric lived, within walls of sod 2 meters thick. Wood is rare on Iceland. There are no windows, just a small smoke outlet in the ceiling. In these dark, sparse rooms, Leif was born in the year 970 AD. 15 years later, his father took him and his family to Greenland, an ice-covered island in the west, discovered during Eric's banishment. It was an incredibly daring undertaking for all those giving up their farms on Iceland. Leif stood beside his father during the dangerous crossing, and he also witnessed how Eric managed to persuade others to come along.
He told his people that he had discovered a green land to the west, what we now call Greenland. It was, of course, a marketing trick to lure other settlers into joining him. Anyway, he won over so many people that a fleet of 25 ships set sail for Greenland.
Eric's glowing descriptions apart, at the end of the 10th century, there were definitively good reasons for leaving Iceland. Natasha takes us to an excavation in Olafsdalur, the Valley of Olaf, which clearly shows what made the Vikings leave. According to Natasha, the discovery of America can only be understood by the phenomenon of island hopping from Norway via Iceland to Greenland. The excavators are investigating a farm from the 10th century, exactly the period when Eric and Leif set out westward. The ship-like layout of the house is still visible. Obviously, this was a considerable estate. So, what had happened?
This homestead dates from the 10th century, when most of the arable land had already been occupied. So when Olaf came to Iceland, he had little choice but to put up with this patch of land here. It was far from ideal for a farmer.
During the past 100 years, Norsemen settling here had exploited the island's nature to such a degree that its resources could no longer meet the demands of everyone. Eric knew where he wanted to go. He took his fleet and sailed along the ice-covered east coast of Greenland, around Cape Farvel, and after 1,500 storm-tossed kilometers, steered them into a fjord, duly named Eriksfjord. In their open boats, they had fought their way west through floating ice, murderous waves and icebergs, threatening to rip open their vessels. 14 of the 25 boats made it. On board were 300 settlers, their cattle and their household goods. Greenland became a crucial stepping stone on the path to the New World. The sagas relate this in colourful detail, of the daring crossing to Greenland and of the nature of the newly discovered land. When reaching Thule, Columbus must have been thrilled by these stories, and most of all, by the deeds of their greatest hero, Leif Erickson, who, as the sagas go, had discovered another mysterious land west of Greenland. And since he found grapes there, he called it Vinland, Wineland. In Iceland's capital Reykjavik, Natasha joins historian Gisli Sigurdsson to take a closer look at the original texts of the sagas. So how factual are these heroic tales of a legendary wineland?
The picture that is drawn up of all these voyages, the chronology, the origins of the people and so on, all fits the general story that the archaeology tells us. And there was no way that people in Iceland at the time could have this accurate historical information from anywhere but a continuous oral tradition. But that doesn't prove that the love affairs and the individuals in the stories are all reflections of what actually happened 200 or 300 years earlier. But something along those general lines is very likely to have been part of a reality in the settlement period.
To the historian, the sagas are more precious than a hoard of gold. Here it's written how in the year 1000 AD, Leif founded the first settlement on a land which had to wait another 500 years to be called America.
All the main places from that single place because it's south of Leif's camp to cross the open water there because you will.
Sigurdsson is convinced that Columbus knew of these sagas.
So I think that also is.
Yet what conclusions might he have drawn from them? How are they related to his later voyages?
The important learning or information that he obtained is that he could cross over open water, sail away from the continent, and continue into the west without ever risking falling off.
So the inquiring young seafarer, who collected all available information and all the maps he could lay his hands on, must have known. There is land in the west, and it had been reached by Europeans long before him. But he also must have known about the dangers of the northern route through the ice-ridden waters off Greenland. Natasha follows the settlers' route into Erick's fjord. With the help of engine power, GPS, and a compass, it's considerably easier than 1,000 years ago. But back then, how did the Vikings chart their route and navigate in the vastness of the Atlantic between Iceland, Greenland, and America? The key to their navigational skill was a small wooden dial with a needle rising in the middle. When sighting the sun, its shadow would fall on a groove, which gave the sailor the cardinal point, enabling him to keep course along a specific latitude. This is what made the Vikings the most proficient seafarers of their time. Brattahlid, in southern Greenland. This is where Leif Erickson lived after he had turned 16, and it's from here that he would soon set out on his own, on voyages to Iceland and Norway, where he took on the Christian faith. A current excavation further inland hints at why Leif left his home once more to venture yet again to pastures new further west. At first glance, the site seems unusual. 3 kilometers from the coast, at the foot of a glacier. It's only accessible via an arduous track. Why did the Vikings choose this barren place? The excavation shows, as on Iceland, late settlers had to go where they still could find unoccupied pastures. As a matter of fact, only a few of Greenland's coastal strips are actually green. 4/5 of the gigantic island's surface are covered by a solid layer of ice, and so all fertile ground was quickly settled. Greenland's population back then must have soon reached a critical size, as proved by an abundance of Viking finds in the area. There are about 20,000 of them, according to chief excavator Christian Koch-Madsen. And this is the showpiece, the skull of a walrus. Only the tusks are missing.
Eye socket.
Walrus ivory was in high demand among the medieval rulers of Europe. It was used to carve prestigious sets of chess figures or reliquaries. Walrus tusks became a prime export commodity for the Greenlanders. When northern Europe had been Christianized, they were even used to pay the tithes. On the other side of the fjord, on a mysterious island off Get, Natasha comes across another unusual source of income for the Viking settlers. Today, Get, now called Igaliku, is merely a cluster of wooden huts. Once this was a rich settlement, and even the seat of a bishop. There was a cathedral, as well as the bishop's manor and huge stables. The measurements of the foundations reveal that the walls must have been massive and solidly constructed. Only wealthy settlers could have afforded such buildings. Written sources document that the inhabitants were able to offer a large sum of money to Norway's King Sigurd to be granted the seat of a bishop. But the Norwegian king demanded more, something very select indeed. To find out more, Natasha heads for an islet offshore. There are strange heaps of stone. The archaeologist recognizes at once that they are the remains of the same massive way of building as on the mainland. But what would have been the purpose of such laboriously and elaborately erected houses on such a tiny island?
We have found a number of houses in the Igaliku area, but even out here there are remains of two very large, massive stone buildings. Since they stood directly opposite the mainland, they must have had a very special function.
So why apply so much effort to transporting blocks of stone weighing up to a ton across the water to build here, when there is ample space and material on the mainland? Was the tiny island a kind of prison, a Viking's Alcatraz? Or were these houses intended as storage rooms for luxury goods?
Walrus ivory was an important commodity that was traded from here to many parts of Europe. But there are also hints that there was trade in polar bear's fur, and maybe even in live polar bears.
A live polar bear. That's exactly what King Sigurd had wanted. A risky proposition for the people of Gardar. But they succeeded. The king got his polar bear, and Greenland its own bishop. Hunting the largest land-based predator may have been profitable, but it was also highly dangerous. Even when captured, the white giants were a deadly menace. There's a story that Leif Erickson went hunting for his first polar bear when he was merely 16. Awaiting their transport to Europe, the huge beasts had to be held in massive cages. And to keep them away from the settlements, just in case, the tiny island would have been the perfect spot. Even if luxury items like polar bears, ivory and furs could be traded for expensive Norwegian wood, life on Greenland remained a constant struggle. For the surplus population, there was only one way out: expansion beyond their homeland. Leif Erickson was of course one of those who looked west, yet Natasha believes that apart from escaping imminent pressures, there may have been other things on his mind.
He was out for fame and glory. He knew that if he returned with precious goods from the new territories, his fellow Norsemen would hold him in great esteem.
And so Leif made his bid and secured himself a place in history. He set course across the Davis Strait, the shortest distance between Greenland and America, followed the coast southward until he became the first European to set foot on American soil, probably in Newfoundland. It was a venture into the unknown, a murderous struggle against the waves. But Leif and 35 companions made it. Maneuvering his ship past towering icebergs, until he made landfall somewhere along the northeastern shores of the American continent. An incredible achievement. If Columbus, as is presumed, heard of Leif's exploits and of his tales of a land far across the Atlantic Ocean, the 26-year-old navigator from Genoa might well have been prompted to envisage a voyage of his own, steering true west, knowing he would make landfall somewhere. Where exactly Leif Erickson set foot on the new continent for the first time, and where else he might have landed, is one of the great unsolved questions of archaeology. Remains of houses near Lanza Meadows in Newfoundland testify to the fact that he did reach America. The layouts are the same as in Greenland or on Iceland. They are the best documented Viking remains ever found in America. Their excavation in the 1960s was a breakthrough in Viking research, proving the historical veracity of the sagas. 11 houses have been located and excavated, 3 of them massive winterproof buildings. Spindle walls tell of the presence of women. This was a permanent settlement with a smithy erected in about 1000 AD. Iron nails, an item unknown to the indigenous Americans, bear witness to its Viking origin. The the fabled Vinland offered what the Norsemen needed most: wood in abundance, for their boats and their large assembly halls. Yet, there remains one question. How much further south did the Vikings advance?
So these butternuts were found on site here at Lanza Meadows. And why they're so relevant and important is, as you can probably see when you were walking around today, there's no butternuts growing in this area, and there never has been. And also the Norse came here looking for grapes, and there was never any grapes growing in Lanza Meadows. So where did they come from?
Butternuts and grapes only grow much further south. Historians presume that the Vikings must have progressed as far as today's New York City. A survey from space was launched to locate settlements further south. When evaluating these images, American archaeologists thought that Point Rosie in southern Newfoundland might be a site worth exploring.
Point Rosie excavation site it's interesting because they originally had identified what might be a farm based on satellite imagery. And so they went in to go and investigate and look at it in more detail. And what they were really hoping to find was evidence of a Viking Age farm. And it looked like there could be a longhouse. It looked like there could be a nice field around it. It looked like there might be some other features.
Yet, as Douglas Bollander recalls, excavating it was anything but easy. The terrain is barely accessible, and the features which stood out so clearly in the satellite images defied precise locating on the ground. However, the team around archaeologist Sarah Parchak found discolorations in the soil which may have resulted from walls of sod, as well as materials that resembled iron clinker from the smithies of the Vikings.
One of the exciting things to come out of the work at Point Rosie, whether or not it is a Viking site, is that the satellite imagery work does seem to be effective. We've tried it in other places. Sarah Parchak has tried it in other locations. And frequently where it looks like there is something, there has been something there. So this is clearly a very effective technique to try to find additional sites.
Alas, at Point Rosie, the high hopes of the researchers were to be disappointed. After all finds had been analysed, there was only one conclusion. What seemed to have been the traces of Viking houses had been caused by natural phenomena. A major disappointment. But there are other new promising approaches of research. Natasha is on her way to Halifax to meet Kevin Smith. He's the foremost expert on Viking archaeology in North America. And his smoking gun is flint. Kevin applies forensic science to examine the samples that have been found at Lanza Meadows, along with the butternuts.
This one.
The finds from America's only known Viking settlement to date are of inestimable value. Accordingly, they are treated with the utmost care.
I think modern technology that we have really gives us a great opportunity for this. The device that we're using, portable X-ray fluorescence, means that we can work on these objects which are part of a World Heritage Site without having to destroy any part of them. In the past, 10, 20 years ago, we would have had to grind the objects out, put them into a nuclear reactor or another sort of a thing, and the object would be partially destroyed. In this case, we can try to solve new mysteries and try to get data right down to the elemental level without having to destroy or damage anything of the heritage. And that's a really important thing. Changes the game entirely.
Natasha is more than eager to join in the new game. Will it produce clues pointing to another Viking settlement on the North American continent? Flint might provide the answer to this question, since there is no natural layer of flint in the area around Lanza Meadows. So where does it come from?
Perfect match.
What we're trying to do here is to find out where the Vikings traveled using pieces of stone, basically the pieces of stone that they used to start fires with, and tracing them back to the places where they came from. It's a little bit like in the old detective movies, where the detective solves the puzzle of the murder by finding a matchbook, and on the matchbook it says where the person had been before. These were the matches in the pockets of the Vikings, and if we can find out where the stones came from that they used to make their stone tools, we know where they came from, and we know where they traveled out to.
Sounds simple enough, but it means that the archaeologists must find samples which match the geochemical fingerprints of the finds in Lanza Meadows. Given the length of the North American East Coast, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack. Finds which resemble the existing samples are checked on the spot for a possible match by using the mobile gauge.
Part of the reason that we're doing this is we're trying to figure out if people went out to different places and they had to get new, as I said, matches, new things to strike fires. If we can find where the sources of those are, we can at least narrow the search down to the areas where those are found.
It's an immense help in surveying an area of such enormous magnitude. Did the Vikings set up colonies on the new continent as they had done on Iceland and Greenland? The fact is that after Leif Erickson's discovery of America, there was a busy trade with Vinland. Ships from Greenland, Iceland and even Norway called at the coast. But where exactly? Drones equipped with state-of-the-art cameras and 3D software are a potential means to facilitate the search. It's a technology which allows wide areas to be scanned in a comparatively short time. The new generation of American Viking hunters hopes that soon not just one, but a swarm of drones will set forth to look for anomalies along the coastal zones. If their 3D profiles reveal conspicuous features reminiscent of, for instance, the layout of a Viking house, archaeologists could pinpoint those sites and inspect them, anything to narrow down the search. Meanwhile, Kevin's geological research has paid first dividends. There are hints that the Norsemen forayed considerably further south than previously assumed, and that they also might have moved further inland. Kevin tells Natasha of his preliminary results. The flint at Lanza Meadows originates from Newfoundland, and probably from Nova Scotia. Kevin assumes that the Vikings even reached the greater area of Quebec and the region of New York, since this is where the butternuts and the grapes might have come from. Whether the Norsemen also established settlements there can only be answered by future excavations. Lanza Meadows was abandoned after some 50 years. The reason why is another enigma of American Viking research. Many experts assume that the Nordic newcomers clashed with the indigenous population. They disparagingly called Skrellingers weaklings.
It certainly had something to do with the indigenous people, yet we don't know exactly what happened. However, another important reason is that the settlers did not get any support from the parent colony on Greenland. Columbus had strong backing from the Spanish Queen, whereas the Viking settlers were on their own.
Queen Isabella of Spain did indeed finance the expeditions of Columbus, and thereby laid the foundations for an immense colonial empire overseas. The Institución Colombina in Seville holds thousands of original documents from that era. Research these days focuses more and more on texts relating to Columbus's travels before he set out across the Atlantic.
Thanks to these documents, we're able to comprehend the thoughts, experiences, and the acts of Christopher Columbus.
Apart from documents on the voyage to Iceland in 1477, the Spanish researcher is particularly interested in a paper in which Columbus refers to a stay in the English port of Bristol 1 year earlier. Back then, Bristol was the starting point for the Iceland trade. Its harbour was filled with ships from Norway, Denmark and Britain. In the quayside taverns, sailors from many countries would meet, boast of their adventures, of daring voyages far out into the Atlantic and to newly discovered lands. The perfect spot for Columbus and his inquiries. There were tales of travels to a mysterious country far out in the west. Saint Brendan, the patron saint of seafarers, was said to have crossed the Atlantic as early as the 6th century AD. In 1460, the Irish monk had even been immortalized in a book illustration. In Bristol, Columbus may also have heard another fascinating lore. It told of a Welsh king named Owain Gwynedd, who, when he died, left 19 sons. One of them was Prince Madoc. As the story goes, he took to sea to escape vicious fighting, focused on the accession to his father's throne. In today's Snowdonia National Park, near Castle Dolwyddelan, a previous building has been located which archaeologists believe was the place where young Madoc was born and raised. Bill Jones of the Dolwyddelan Historical Society is an expert on the life of Madoc. He's convinced that the Welsh prince did indeed brave the Atlantic Ocean.
In the 1970s,
it was a tale long cherished by the seafaring nation of Great Britain, ideally suited to bolster its claim on the American colonies.
Yeah, and it's all more or less silted up over the years.
Today, scientists believe that it may hold some truth. So what was the situation like in Wales some 750 years ago?
There was a lot of family feuding. Owain Gwynedd and his sons, they didn't get on as it was in this part of Wales at that time, yeah.
I would describe that time as a period of political upheaval, where you had a lot of feuding going on between different family members, you had different dynasties. Possibly a good description might be the Games of Thrones.
The Joneses agree that those were wild times. Bill took part in the excavations of the castle where Madoc was born. To him, the ruins are proof that there was a King Owain, that he had numerous sons, and that the oral tradition can be trusted.
That's one with the castle in the background, you see?
Yeah.
But these trees were quite big then.
Yes, yeah.
The castle was perfectly situated to dominate the valley. So it was a good place to be, but also the site of a relentless Game of Thrones.
I think potentially, like, you could relate it to, you know, the modern day. Many people feel the need to escape if things are chaotic. Therefore, yes, potentially it's just that general feeling. He was quite young. I think he was born in 1150, and then he left in 1170, so he was, you know, in his early 20s. Therefore, yes, potentially that's the reason.
This had happened 200 years before with the Vikings. They too had left everything behind to find a new home beyond the horizon. Allegedly, Madoc even returned one more time in 1171 to recruit settlers for his new land across the ocean, and then set sail with 10 ships. Researchers have reconstructed his possible route, from Wales across the Irish Sea, then on across the Atlantic Ocean, heading southwest, making landfall in Mobile Bay, Alabama. There are several large rivers flowing into the bay, and on each of them, Madoc and his boats could have penetrated far inland. Time and again, historians have tried to verify the legend of Madoc on American soil, with the DeSoto Falls in Georgia catching their attention. Next to them are strange caves, intriguingly called Welsh caves by the locals. The entrances, it is said, were once protected by stone walls, for good reason. because the Welsh were certainly not alone. And the New World is new only to them. The indigenous people had expelled the Vikings up in the north. Did the same happen down here? Yet, is there really any substance to the legend of Madoc? At Athens State College in Alabama, historian Ronald Fritzer has followed up on the countless stories woven around the Welsh prince. In those tales, the arrival in Mobile Bay is a recurring theme, as are the references to strife and feuds among the clans of 12th century Wales, which had given us the cause for Madoc's exodus. Other than in Wales, the story of Madoc is little known in the United States. There are only a few researchers like Ronald Fritzer who seriously engage in evaluating historical and archaeological data on his alleged presence in North America. One of the key questions in the debate is whether the voyage of Madoc is a legend or merely a myth. Ronald Fritzer explains the difference and its implications.
The story of Madoc can be viewed by some people as a legend and by other people as a myth. And if it's a legend, that would make it where there actually was a Welsh voyage and we're just trying to piece together the details. If it's a myth, that's a story that is actually made up and did not occur. And there's arguments for both sides, whether it be a legend or a myth.
Deep in the forests of Tennessee, there are, however, some remarkable clues in favor of the presence of Europeans. They consist of huge blocks of stone, which have been carved into shape by metal tools. Madoc researchers assume that they once were part of a fortress. It might have looked like this, placed on high ground to control the river valley. There is no archaeological evidence that the indigenous people of the area ever built in stone. So had this fortress been erected by people from medieval Europe? As experts on the other side of the Atlantic see it, the building's design, materials and the size of the blocks all fit the details of Welsh castles. The Tennessee ruins may be a hint, but they alone are not sufficient proof of Madoc's presence on American soil. Yet, there's a most unexpected clue, and it concerns an alleged encounter between the Welsh and the Native Americans. What if the Welsh warriors had met an Indian tribe, which back then roamed the area between the Tennessee and the Ohio rivers? What if this encounter had been peaceful, in contrast to that of the Vikings and the tribes of the north? Ronald Fritzer can call up a witness, albeit an indirect one.
George Catlin, the painter, when he visited them in the early 1830s, he basically observed what he thought were Indians with like blue eyes or blondish colored hair and that sort of thing. Again, you can see
Catlin's observations are confirmed by another explorer, the German Maximilian Prince zu Wied, who traveled the land of the Mandan at about the same time.
There was a fort in the area where the Mandans were at. It was for trees.
He too noticed that some of the Indians were particularly light-skinned under their war paint, and so another legend was born, that of Prince Madoc and the White Indians. Did the Welsh warriors merge with the Mandan tribe? And did the Mandan in turn pick up some of their vocabulary? A Welsh missionary who was active in the area was allegedly able to communicate with them rather well. And what's more, their huts are said to have resembled those of medieval Welsh villages. And some had strikingly blue eyes. George Catlin was one of the first to state that there were Welsh words embedded in the Mandan language. However, such encounters were prone to all sorts of misunderstandings. And now it's impossible to follow up on Catlin's observations. At the end of the 19th century, the Mandan had been expelled from their land and forced into reservations, where they were almost totally wiped out by epidemics. Yet, there is some more evidence of a link between the Welsh and the Mandan. As this old sketch shows, their boats have nothing in common with the typical canoes of other indigenous tribes. They closely resemble the coracles, simple contraptions made of tarred animal skin and elastic lumber struts, which are still used by Welsh fishermen today. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that the Mandan boats owed their design to Welsh immigrants. The same goes for another find from the Mandan's territory: Roman coins. In Madoc's days, they were still used as a currency throughout medieval Europe. Another strange tale concerns a grave on the banks of the Ohio River, supposedly dating from 1186. In 1799, a party of locals is said to have exhumed 6 skeletons, covered by breastplates displaying a Welsh coat of arms. Alas, if they ever actually existed, the breastplates have long since vanished. So there's a lot of evidence, but it's mostly circumstantial. Over in Wales, however, they are convinced that the legend of Prince Madoc having arrived in America 300 years before Columbus is based on facts.
I don't think there is any archaeological evidence. However, you know, there's a lot of mention of him in literature. So potentially, yes, there is potentially some truth behind it.
In northern Wales, where Madoc once lived, and from where he allegedly set sail, they firmly believe in a hero, whom history has almost and unjustly forgotten.
Well, they said that Christopher Columbus was the first to discover America, but I think that Prince Madoc did that about 300 years before.
Back to Seville. The city is deeply marked by its Moorish past, and Columbus would have encountered it wherever he turned, especially in its libraries, which still hold hundreds of Arabic documents. Some of them tell of an expedition that set out westward from Africa. As an eager collector of any nautical data, Columbus would not have missed these reports.
His travels, be it up north or along the African coast, helped him to develop an ever more complete image of the world. And on these journeys, he met many people who provided him with new information.
In 1483, Columbus signs up on a Portuguese trading ship. Its destination suits him perfectly: the Arabic world of West Africa. His enthusiasm comes across in his log. He draws maps, makes precise notes of wind conditions and currents. He's now 32 years old and has spent 18 of them on the high seas, becoming a master mariner. After the return from his African voyage, he begins to put together plans for a westward venture that, he believes, will take him to India. In Africa, he cannot but have heard more of the legendary westward expedition of Abu Bakr II, the king he had already read about in the Arabian Chronicles back in Seville. In the markets of West Africa, storytellers still animatedly recount the feats of the king, who, according to them, in 1310, boldly set sail for America. A tale brimming with pride about past exploits. Abu Bakr, it says, took to sea with a gigantic fleet in search of the shores beyond the great sea of Al-Muhit, the Atlantic Ocean. It may sound fantastic, but the story has a good number of supporters here in Africa. The Empire of Mali back then encompassed parts of today's Niger, Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. Its rulers viewed themselves as the successors of the Egyptian pharaohs. Ancient Mali was an African superpower. The trans-Sahara trade to Timbuktu, as well as huge deposits of gold, made the rulers of Mali immensely rich. Abu Bakr's successor, King Musa, has left a report on the voyage of his predecessor, which is cited in Arabic documents. To Mamadou Diallo from Gaston University in Senegal, these sources are highly reliable, since they emanated at almost the same time as the events they describe.
In the 14th century, this African king undertook an expedition to America. It was an undertaking of pharaoh-like dimensions.
The estuary of the Senegal River provides a huge natural harbour. It's from here that Abu Bakr is said to have set sail with a fleet of 2,000 ships. Surely an exaggeration, yet he definitely had the means to do so. His successor, King Musa, probably was the richest man of his times, if not of all time. An extrapolation of his wealth runs up to $400 billion. On his pilgrimage to Mecca, he allegedly took along a retinue of 60,000 and 12 tons of gold, carried by 80 camels. During a stay in Cairo, he mentioned Abu Bakr's fantastic voyage to the governor. This conversation was duly chronicled by an Arab scribe. Mamadou Diallo has thoroughly analysed the content of this source. Even today, the Senegal estuary is filled with hundreds of boats. Traditional pirogues used by the African fishermen to venture far out onto the open sea. Western experts, however, are doubtful that Africans 700 years ago had the know-how to cross the Atlantic Ocean.
I am convinced that African ships back then had the same kind of rigging as their European counterparts when they began navigating the high seas.
Western researchers doubt that a fleet once sailed from San Luis across Al-Muhit to America. To their African colleagues, this is a clear case of Eurocentric arrogance. Arabic knowledge of geography, navigation, astronomy, and the prevailing winds and currents would have provided a sound basis for a crossing from West Africa to South America. At least for a one-way voyage. That's why several experts believe Abu Bakr could have made it there, but not back. His whereabouts remain a mystery. However, did some of his boats reach the American continent after all? Columbus states in his logs that he had heard of black natives and had seen cotton cloths like those he had come across in Guinea, and metal spearheads, which when he had them analysed in Spain, fitted exactly the composition of those in West Africa.
Voyages like that of Abu Bakr had two goals. One was discovery, to find another continent beyond the Great Sea. The second was conquest. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, during the African Middle Ages, there were many expeditions sent out to conquer new land.
So were there Arabic African conquistadors in America? Maybe, since many seafarers following in Columbus's wake mentioned black-skinned people among the indigenous populations. One thing is certain, Columbus was not the first to reach America. There were others before him whose tracks he followed. The ruler of Mali might have reached South America by making use of the trade winds. It's possible, but there's no proof. Welsh Prince Madoc could have reached the Gulf of Mexico. There are several written hints to that end, as well as some evidence on the spot. That Leif Erickson was the first European to set foot on American soil 500 years before Columbus is an established fact. Latest research has even shown that the Vikings intended to establish a far-flung net of colonies, or had at least achieved much in this direction. Christopher Columbus knew that others had preceded him, having read or heard about their voyages. He did not venture into the unknown. He knew there was a landmass in the west, and that it must be of immense size if it could be reached from Africa, as well as from the British Isles and from the far north. Nevertheless, when he brought home the news of a new world, Columbus heralded a turning point in the history of mankind. An age of exploration, conquest, and exploitation. That is what has secured him a place in history.